Right now in our Foundation series, we're going over the son of Israel known as Joseph. Commonly, he's known as the King of Dreams. And in part 1, we talked about this dream that he had of being a ruler over his family. After being framed for a crime he didn't commit, now he's in charge of a prison that he was placed in. And in this episode, we're going to get into the truth of Joseph's story and truly explain his title as the King of Dreams. So we begin part 2 as Joseph is now in prison in Egypt. He's been framed for a crime he didn't commit, and now he's gonna have to figure out what to do from here. Now this chapter, Genesis chapter 40, starts out really interesting as 2 of Pharaoh's servants get thrown into prison alongside Joseph. Immediately we see as the cupbearer and the baker of the Pharaoh are put into prison because the Pharaoh is just upset at them for different reasons. Now both of them begin to have dreams, and this is where we really get into the understanding of who Joseph is and what his abilities are when it comes to interpretation and understanding dreams in a better way. He starts to realize that as he's in prison, these 2 obviously are not acting normal. They're both downcast and they're upset about something. So he asks them what's going on, and they both say that they've had a dream. Now I love Joseph in this moment because he's ready to interpret these guys' dreams, but he doesn't take the credit for it. I love that he says this right here: "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." This is a huge point of showing us who Joseph is, that he's not selfish in his gifting, that God is able to work through him because he's not taking the credit for it. He's making sure that people understand where this interpretation is coming from. First, the cupbearer. He says that there are 3 vines in his dream, and that on each of these 3 vines, grapes burst forward, and he was able to squeeze those grapes into a cup and give it to the Pharaoh. Now, Joseph interpreted this dream pretty quickly. He actually determined that the 3 vines are 3 days, and in 3 days, the cupbearer will be reinstated into his place next to the Pharaoh in order to continue doing his job. After interpreting his dream, the only thing that Joseph asks of the cupbearer is that he remembers him when he goes back to Pharaoh and puts in a good word for him so that he can maybe get out of this prison sentence that he didn't deserve in the first place. And since the baker saw that the cupbearer's dream was so good, he was excited to have Joseph interpret his dream as well. So he begins to explain what his dream was. So in his dream, he had 3 different cake baskets on his head, and in the uppermost basket, he had all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh. However, birds were eating out of these baskets, and he didn't know why that was. So then Joseph immediately begins to interpret his dream, and let's just say it's not as good as the cupbearer's. Turns out that the 3 baskets means 3 days, and on that 3rd day, Pharaoh will kill the baker. He will hang him, and then the birds will eat at his flesh. Not a very good interpretation, at least for the baker. He wasn't too hyped about that, I'm sure. And with the cupbearer hoping that Joseph is right and the baker hoping that Joseph is wrong, they waited those 3 days. And it just so happened that 3 days later was the Pharaoh's birthday. And of course, when it's a ruler's birthday, all sorts of craziness, I'm sure, happens everywhere in the world. And just as Joseph had interpreted from their dreams, the cupbearer was reinstated and began to serve the Pharaoh once again. But the head baker was executed and hung. Not a great ending for him. But even after all of that happening and seeing only 3 days later that he's restored to his position, the cupbearer doesn't remember Joseph, and he totally forgets to talk to Pharaoh about him. Now, this may be that he chickened out and he doesn't want to bother Pharaoh with another request because he's just been in jail and he's scared about it. Or this could be that he really just forgot. We don't know. So now Joseph is stuck in jail yet again with no hope of getting out. The cupbearer was no use to him. So 2 years actually pass while he's still in prison. But then something interesting happens. The Pharaoh begins to have dreams, specifically 2 dreams. And the first dream goes like this. This is all about cows coming out of the Nile River. There are 2 sets of cows that come out of the Nile. The first set is 7 cows that come out, and they are attractive and plump and ready to eat. But the second set of 7 cows comes out and they are thin, ugly, and they look famished. However, when the cows are standing next to each other, the thin cows begin to consume the healthy cows. This is like a nightmare, and the Pharaoh doesn't know exactly what it means. But then he tries to go back asleep, and he has another dream right after that about grain this time. In this dream, he sees 14 stalks of grain. The first 7 are plump and good. The second 7 are ugly and withered and blighted. Then he watched as the thin and blighted stalks begin to consume the more plump and good stalks, and then he awakes again. Now, Pharaoh is very confused by these dreams, especially since he had two of these dreams back to back that are very similar. He doesn't know what to do, but then he begins to send out and asks all of his magicians and his seers and his wise men if they could interpret the dreams, and they can't. Nobody knows what these dreams are supposed to be. At least they can't come to a consensus, and so he's very upset by this. But then, since he's part of the royal court, the cupbearer remembers Joseph and says to Pharaoh that there is a Hebrew in the pit that would maybe be able to interpret his dreams. So immediately Pharaoh calls up Joseph. They give him a good shave and give him some nicer clothes since he's been in prison for at least the last 2 or 3 years. And now he's in front of Pharaoh. Joseph, I'm sure, is terrified. But at the same time, he's ready to answer whatever question Pharaoh has. So Pharaoh begins to ask him if he can interpret this dream or not. And again, I love this response that Joseph gives here. It's just so perfect. And so when Pharaoh asks him if he can interpret the dream, he says, "It is not in me." God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Again, not taking the glory for himself, but pointing to Elohim and telling them that Elohim is the one that's doing this. The Pharaoh goes on to explain his dreams again to Joseph. And immediately Joseph begins to give an interpretation given to him by God. He explains that the healthy cows and grain are the next 7 years in Egypt, that it's going to be bountiful. There's going to be a ton of crop and a great harvest. However, after that is going to come 7 years of famine, and it's going to be really, really intense. Again, Joseph goes on to give God the glory. He says that this is what God is going to do, and he's told you this twice because this is a fixed thing. There's nothing that we can do to get God to change what's going to happen in the future. He's just letting us know that this is going to happen. Then immediately, without even letting Pharaoh respond, he begins to lay out a perfect plan for what they need to do over the next 7 years in order to survive the famine that's coming. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Immediately, I'm sure everybody in the room, including Pharaoh, understood that Joseph was different. Not only did he interpret these dreams, but he also immediately came up with a perfect plan in order for them to survive the famine. Pharaoh begins to ask himself, is there anyone else that could take this on? Any leaders that would be able to actually execute this plan? And he comes to the conclusion very quickly that Joseph is the only person that could do this, that somehow God had brought him here for this purpose. In fact, he says that there is none as discerning or wise as Joseph. This is an insane compliment coming from the ruler of Egypt, who is considered a god amongst his people. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. You can see that immediately Pharaoh understood the position that he was in trouble if he didn't get this famine under control in the next 7 years, and Joseph was the guy to do it. So he lifted him up into a position of power and allowed him to become something like a vizier. We can clearly see here that this is not just a reward for Joseph interpreting the dreams, but because he's able to take on this new responsibility and help Pharaoh out to save his kingdom, this means a lot more to Pharaoh than he ever could have imagined these dreams would. This means that Joseph is now the second in command, and only second in command in title. Pharaoh actually puts him above everybody else in Egypt, in the entire land. This is crazy, right? But we're seeing this ladder that Joseph is on over and over and over again, from Potiphar's house being in charge of all of that, even to the prison where he was in charge of all of that. Then God brings him in front of the Pharaoh, and now Pharaoh is using him as the main person to run all of Egypt. This is an intense life that Joseph is living, from being sold into slavery now to being in the second command, really the ruler of Egypt. Now, I'm not even going to try to say this name, but Pharaoh changes Joseph's name to
Tzafnat Pa'aneach.
And this is the name that he uses in order to rule Egypt during the rest of his life. Now, at this point, when he begins to serve Pharaoh, Joseph is 30 years old, the same age as me. He's given a wife, and then he begins to focus on what he needs to do for the next 7 years of plenty before the 7 years of famine. Immediately, he begins to store up grain wherever he can, taking a percentage from here and a percentage from there, making sure that everybody that's working is giving into the storehouses in order for them to survive through the 7-year famine. He actually does such a good job that they lose count of how much grain is stored up. Not in a bad way either, like they were being lazy, but there's actually too much grain for them to count, period. The Bible states it as like the sand of the sea. This is an enormous amount of food stored up. During this time as well, Joseph has his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who are 2 characters that we hear referenced a lot later on in the scriptures. And just as the 7 years of plenty come to an end, and just as the dreams had told the Pharaoh, the 7 years of famine were upon them. And now everyone was starting to run out of food. However, since Joseph's plan was in full effect, there was plenty of food for everybody in Egypt. In fact, way more than Egypt could ever use. So Egyptians began to buy the grain and use for their own purposes so that they didn't starve during the famine. However, they didn't realize that the famine would get so bad that it affected not just Egypt, not just the Middle East, but the entire world. Now, this phrase, all over the earth or all over the world, could be an interesting debated phrase because we're not exactly sure what the writer of Genesis knew as the entire world. But we can take it for this sense that everything in the large area around Egypt was all impacted by the famine as well. So actually everybody in the world came to Egypt for food, all because of Joseph's smart thinking and because of the message that God gave him. So you have to understand this just from a logical point of view. Joseph single-handedly saved Egypt, and not only Egypt, but the entire world. God put him there for a very specific reason. There's a reason why the cupbearer didn't get Joseph out of jail earlier, right? It needed to be at this specific time for this specific reason so that Pharaoh could interact with Joseph in this way, and that so Joseph could store the grain in the way that he did in order to save not only Egypt, not only Israel, not only the people of the nations around them, but the entire world. It's crazy to think about that. And to think about the state of the world during that time, that Egypt was the center of everything because they're the only ones that had food. So now you can see why Joseph was called the king of dreams, because now he's legitimately a king over all of Egypt, and he interprets dreams because God gives him the ability to do so. Now, this isn't even the climax of Joseph's story. Next time, we're going to dive into some really interesting things and talk about how God uses bad things to create good circumstances. So if you want to support more videos like this, go to our Patreon down below, and YouTube thinks that you should watch this video right here. We'll see you next week for our Foundation series.